and welcome to episode 51 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this edition of the podcast, we're going to discuss the most important statistical measure for an NFL quarterback and why it is the great delineator between the best and the average quarterbacks in the NFL. Plus, I'll give you some insights and reaction and analysis of the news that Spider-Man is returning to the MCU after a 2-month divorce between Sony and Marvel Studios. So let's open up a cold one and get started on episode 51 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Topic number one on this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast, I wanted to discuss the most important stat when it comes to quarterbacks, how I gauge them. And I know everyone's got a different opinion about what's most important. But the reason why I wanted to specifically focus on this statistical measure is because following our conversation last week where we talked about the 3 big-name quarterbacks from the 2004 NFL Draft, that being Phillip Rivers, Eli Manning, and Ben Roethlisberger, I know I brought up a lot of points and a lot of stats and a lot of information that it may just sound like I'm almost doing a PowerPoint presentation, but there's a reason why I emphasize the stats that I do. And there's also a reason why I de-emphasize the traditional statistical measures that most people have used when it comes to the quarterback position. I've always been of the belief that the most overrated stat when it comes to the quarterback position in the NFL is the wins and loss record. I say that because I don't value it as highly as other people do. I think there is a value to that measurement because it is certainly an encapsulation of a player's success with said team. But as I've said here on the podcast, on 97.3 ESPN, and on many other platforms over the years, people act like the quarterback is the sole winner or loser of a football game sometimes. It absolutely exasperates me. Football is the ultimate team sport. There's a reason why there's 53 guys on a roster. There's a reason why there's 11 on each side of the ball. Because it's about a cohesive unit working together and all the elements lining up to allow for success. A lot of times we overlook the value and the importance of the other players on the field because the quarterback gets the most media focus. It gets the most attention. If you play fantasy football, if you don't have a good quarterback, you're probably not winning your fantasy league. So there's a lot of different reasons why people are so focused on the quarterback position. It's the glamour position. It's the position that people aspire to be many times when they're growing up to play football. And I understand that, and I'm not denying that something that is real. But what I'm trying to explain to you is that if we only measure quarterbacks by wins and losses and championships, statistical measures like that, we're overlooking the big picture, which is what differentiates Trent Dilfer from Dan Marino? What differentiates a Mark Rippon from a Jim Kelly? What differentiates Brad Johnson from Donovan McNabb? Whatever quarterbacks you want to use, the winners and the losers of Super Bowls, the reality is that winning a Super Bowl is a team accomplishment, not an individual accomplishment. And there may be part of the reason why, as a society, people tend to still gravitate toward the individual sports because at the end of the day, people still want their superstars and the best athlete on the planet to be a champion. You know, no one ever talks about a guy who is a boxer or an MMA fighter who never won a championship as one of the greatest of all time. No one ever talks about a tennis player who's only won 4 or 5 majors, one of the greatest. No, you want a guy who's won 10, 15, 20 titles in majors to be the best golfer, tennis player, or whatever it may be in an individual realm. So I understand that we tend to be drawn to championships as the highest achievement. But the statistic that I'm going to present to you is an eye-opening way for you, year in and year out, to always differentiate between the average to above average quarterbacks in the NFL from the great quarterbacks in the NFL. And this is a stat that can be used at any level of football, but it's more eye-opening at the NFL level because in college, I think there's a lot of other things you have to factor in because guys play different schedules, guys play in different offenses. So there are other things you have to factor in. The NFL, it's pretty straightforward. You're playing usually the best of the best on planet Earth when it comes to football. So the stat that I'm referring to is the touchdown to interception ratio. And the reason why I zero in on this statistic is because it is the one stat that involves the highest and the lowest aspects of a quarterback's success. When a quarterback is being successful and he's having a great season, he's going to compile a lot of touchdowns because he might be in an offense that is functioning at a high level or because he is operating at a high level that's elevating everyone else around him. Whatever the reason is, those touchdowns are a symbol and a signal to everyone else what is going on. The interception on the flip side shows the lows. And a quarterback who throws a lot of interceptions is usually a quarterback who's a bad decision maker. He's not good at understanding defenses. He's too much of a risk taker. He does not fully understand the offense he's functioning in. Maybe he doesn't have a good relationship with the receivers that he's playing with. There could be a lot of reasons why a player might have a lot of interceptions, but usually a player with a lot of interceptions is somebody who's having a bad year. And it's not just because he might have bad receivers. I'm going to give you the list of the different quarterbacks in the NFL after 4 weeks in the NFL who have the best touchdown to interception ratio. Let's start with the 3 quarterbacks who have thrown 0 interceptions this year. Pat Mahomes has 10 touchdowns. Russell Wilson has 8 touchdowns. Marcus Mariota has 7 touchdowns. All 3 of them have 0 interceptions. Most people would agree that Patrick Mahomes and Russell Wilson are 2 of the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFL. So it's no surprise that they are high on this list. It's a little bit more surprise that Marcus Mariota is high on this list, but I think that's partially because people look at the Titans and don't think of them as an offensive juggernaut. They kind of look at the Titans as more of a defensive team that's winning games than an offense that's going out and winning games consistently. But for Mariota to have 0 interceptions versus 7 touchdowns this year is a very impressive number. Now, the quarterbacks who have 1 interception but have a very good touchdown to interception ratio. So, for example, Tom Brady, 7 touchdowns, 1 interception. That's a +6. Deshaun Watson, 7 touchdowns, 1 interception, also a +6. Aaron Rodgers, 6 touchdowns, 1 interception, a +5. So that means that Brady and Rodgers, 2 of the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFL, and Deshaun Watson maybe will consider in the 10 to 12 range among quarterbacks in the NFL. So we've already named 4 of the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFL without contention. Nobody's going to argue those names. Mariota, I understand, is a little bit of surprise. Watson's more of a top 10 quarterback than a top 5 quarterback at this moment in the NFL. Now we're going to go to the quarterbacks who have only 2 interceptions and a high number of touchdowns. Both Jacoby Brissett and Lamar Jackson have 10 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. That is a +8 ratio. Now, you have to think about the offenses they run are very different. Lamar Jackson is in an offense that functions as a big play offense off of an effective running game with a quarterback who is a dual threat. Jacoby Brissett is working in an offense that is a variation of the West Coast offense in which the quarterback is functioning in an offense that is going to use the running game as a support for the passing game, but the passing game is going to be the priority in that offense. And even though the Colts are not undefeated, Brissett's having a very efficient year. In fact, if you look at Brissett's numbers across the board, it's not like there's been a huge drop-off from Andrew Luck to Brissett from last year's first 4 weeks to this year's first 4 weeks. Now, the next group of quarterbacks who have 9 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, Matthew Stafford and Carson Wentz. Both have 9 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Stafford and Wentz are considered 2 of the best quarterback talents in the NFL. Stafford is much older than Wentz. He's probably closer to being out of his prime than being in his prime at this point. But he has still shown over the last few years that when he is playing in a good, efficient offense, He is a great conductor for the efficiency in that offense. Meanwhile, Carson Wentz has shown when he is surrounded by a good supporting cast. For example, in 2017, when he had one of the best receiving corps in drops versus targets in the NFL, he was very good. He was an MVP candidate. In his rookie year, he struggled. He had a very poor touchdown to interception ratio, 16-14. But his receivers also were among the worst in the NFL in drops per target. So if you think about it, Wentz, for as talented as he is still a byproduct and a beneficiary of the talent around him. Finally, on this list, you have Phillip Rivers, 7 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. That is also a +5 like Aaron Rodgers. We should also note that Rivers is playing in an offense where guys continually get injured. His top tight end, Henry, has been injured. In the last few years, Keenan Allen has had health issues. Mike Williams has had health issues. He lost one of his wide receivers to the free agent market, and Tyrell Williams. You're talking about a guy who has basically had to make do with limitations in his offense, and he is still going out there and being very efficient at a 69.2 completion percentage, one of the highest in the NFL. Now, this is where we make a side note. I am only including quarterbacks who have started every game for their team in the 2009 season. So we're not going to have a conversation about Gardner Minshew. We're not going to have a conversation about Mason Rudolph here. We're not going to have a conversation about Jimmy Garoppolo. By the way, Jimmy Garoppolo has a horrible touchdown-interception ratio anyway. 5 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. His team's only played 3 games. They're bye week with week 4, so we can't include him in the conversation anyway. So I'm not going to include quarterbacks who have not started every game for their team this year. And if you notice, every quarterback on this list, Mahomes, Wilson, Brady, Rodgers, 4 of the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFL. Then you have Watson, Lamar Jackson, Carson Wentz, among the best young talents in the NFL. Phillip Rivers, still one of the most talented passers in the NFL. Stafford, one of the most talented passers in the NFL. And then you have the outliers, which are Brissett and Mariota, 2 young quarterbacks who are maturing as quarterbacks and are showing that they can be efficient in 2019, whereas maybe in the past people were wondering about their ability to play well. For example, with Mariota, he's had a bit of a roller coaster career. He's had ups and downs. He's had multiple offensive coordinators. He has not had a lot of consistency in terms of coaching or in talent around him. On the flip side, Jacoby Brissett is a very interesting test case in quarterback gets change of scenery, quarterback gets thrust into the spotlight because of injury to superstar. Can he continue to have success? And I would argue that Jacoby Brissett is probably in one of the best situations in the NFL because he's being coached by a man who is not just a very good backup quarterback in the NFL, but who also backed up a Hall of Famer and was known as Captain Comeback because when he came in as a reserve to fill in for the starter, he had these major moments in the NFL as well as college, that being Frank Reich. So you have someone who understands the position, understands where Brissett is coming from as a backup, being thrust in the starting position, and you look at Reich's success in mentoring and working with quarterbacks like Carson Wentz, like Phillip Rivers, and you realize that Reich understands the quarterback position. So Brissett's in a great situation, and that's why I'm not totally surprised that he is on this list. So the quarterbacks I listed, Mahomes, Wilson, Mariota, Brady, Rodgers, Watson, Brissett, Lamar Jackson, Matthew Stafford, Wentz, and Phillip Rivers, they are all in this category that I give you, which is the best touchdown to interception ratios. And it's no coincidence that these are all either the best 10 quarterbacks in the NFL or they're among the best talented quarterbacks in the NFL. It's no coincidence that a quarterback's success can be directly linked to the touchdown and the interception ratio. In fact, when you look at this list of 11 quarterbacks, you realize they also have something else in common. None of them have a losing record. That's right. When you look at the NFL standings right now, Brady's Patriots are 4-0. Mahomes' Chiefs are 4-0. The Los Angeles Chargers, Phillip Rivers' team, are 2-2, not a losing record. Lamar Jackson's Ravens are 2-2, not a losing record. The Texans are 2-2. The Colts are 2-2. The Titans are 2-2, all not losing records. The Eagles are 2-2, not a losing record. The Seahawks are 3-1. That's Russell Wilson's team. Aaron Rodgers' Packers are 3-1. Matthew Stafford's Lions are 2-1-1. So again, there is a direct link between the success of a quarterback's touchdown to interception ratio and also his team's success. Now, it's not a guarantee that the team's going to win a Super Bowl, but the quarterback is not putting you in a position to not be successful, because the interception is more than just a turnover. It is something that frustrates coaches. It frustrates teammates. It is something that stalls momentum. It is something that is arguably one of the worst turnovers in football. It forces the quarterback to have to go back to the drawing board, and you lose a little confidence in your quarterback, even if it is for that moment in time, whether you're a coach or you're a player. And when you have a quarterback who is mistake prone, whether it's fumbles or interceptions, when you have a quarterback who is not efficient when it comes to playing the game of football, it is going to hurt the team's success on the field and in the win column. So the next time you want to talk about who the best quarterbacks in the NFL are, let's look at their touchdown to interception ratio instead of their win-loss record, because it is no coincidence that the quarterbacks with the best touchdown to interception ratios are among the best at their position, and their success on the field translates into wins for their team as well. Topic number 2 on episode 51 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Obviously, have to talk about the huge news that hit over the weekend. Spider-Man is coming back to the MCU. It was just a couple months ago that we were talking about the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe without Spider-Man again. Well, the deal got done over the weekend, and the way it's going to work is Disney will put up 25% of the budget for the third Spider-Man film in exchange for 25% of the gross profits. Now, this is a huge upgrade for Disney, because previously Disney was only getting 5% of the initial gross profit, while the financing was a little ambiguous, shall we call it, about how much they were investing in the movie. Disney's argument was that they were investing a lot of resources into making movies without having a large enough return on said investment. The suggestion, according to different reports, is that the 25% of the budget is actually a reflection of Disney and Marvel spending less money and less resources on a third Spider-Man movie, while Sony taking more financial responsibility for the initial costs up front, instead of Marvel and Disney doing so much of the legwork and Sony making so much of the profit on the back end. Also a part of this agreement, there will be at least one other MCU movie that Spider-Man will appear in. We'll get to that in a little bit. I want to discuss exactly why this deal got done. This deal didn't get done because Disney and Marvel were desperate to get Spider-Man back into the MCU. Do not get it twisted. This was not a power play by Disney and Marvel out of desperation. This was an agreement that came out because I think Sony had some cooler heads prevail when it came to the financial profitability of Spider-Man. It's more than just the harsh backlash that came from all the fans who were unhappy about Tom Holland leaving the MCU. This had to do with the fact that Sony has people involved in their organization that have specific plans and visions and ideas for the different Spider-Man characters. There have been multiple reports, whether they're 100% true or not, that one of the executives at Sony is dead set on producing and developing and executing a Morbius film. Morbius is a character that was acquired by Sony as part of the theatrical distribution rights from the Spider-Man deal over 20 years ago. Apparently, that same executive was the fuel behind the ending of the Disney-Sony relationship. Sony has been dead set on having control over every property they have moving forward, because the people at Sony realize that the world of film and the world of all types of entertainment products that world is shrinking. It's not shrinking in terms of content. It's shrinking in terms of ownership. Now that Disney has taken over 21st Century Fox Studios, now that NBC, Universal, and Xfinity/Comcast are all one company, now that Time Warner and AOL are one company, now that Sony is actually losing actual partners along the way because companies like Viacom have absorbed a lot of Paramount's properties as well. The world of entertainment and the world of content distribution and the world that we know as consumers is changing, and that same changes are affecting the people who are producing the content that we watch at the movie theater or at home. However you get your content, whether it is actually seeing the movie when it comes out, waiting until it comes out on digital, whether you cut the cord with cable, whatever way you go about getting your content, you have to understand that Sony is trying to stay ahead of the curve and not lose money in the long run and not lose a hold on the overall market. Sony understands they will make more money with the Marvel Cinematic Universe label on it than they would without that stamp. Not saying they couldn't make hundreds of millions of dollars, but if you have the opportunity to make up to, let's say, $2 billion gross versus only 600 to 700 million worldwide, you're going to want to make the extra $300 million on the gross. And I think that's where the people at Sony, cooler heads prevailed, because they realized that if you go back through the history of all the Spider-Man movies, after the initial Sam Raimi run in the early 2000s, the second batch of Spider-Man films did not make that much money domestically. In fact, they were considered failures domestically, despite the fact they made even more money internationally. Sony understands that their direct market money is made in the United States less than it is internationally, because a lot of the international money is not made on the digital, Blu-ray, direct to your device market. There are more sales typically when it comes to a movie after it's left theaters in the United States than it is internationally. So while you may make more money internationally for a lot of these superhero properties, depending on the title, like, for example, the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies, you're not making that much money on the back end in terms of the movie after it leaves theaters. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is turning out billion-dollar properties. They're making money hand over fist. And now with the Disney Plus platform and the interweaving of all these characters into the shows that you see, there's way too much value being left on the table for Sony to just be selfish and greedy and basically be a bunch of control freaks and not cooperate with Marvel. The value for Marvel is that now they can shift around their properties in a way that doesn't hurt their already set in stone plans, but also doesn't take away from what Sony wants to do with their individual properties. For example, there's already plans for a second Venom movie, which has no impact on the Spider-Man movie. If the Morbius movie ever does hit production and comes out, whether it's 2021, 2022, that's not going to affect what Marvel's doing or what Spider-Man's doing as well. The next Into the Spider-Verse animated film is not affected by any plans as well. And what Tom Holland does in the MCU never will affect what is happening with Sony's individual properties. I think the bigger question is, what exactly is Marvel and Sony going to do with the Spider-Man movie? The Spider-Man movie, which has been announced for July 16th, 2021. The timing of the movie is very intriguing because Marvel executive Kevin Feige has already explained to people that the shows on Disney Plus are going to be directly linked to the movie. So, for example, the film that comes out before Spider-Man in 2021, Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness, its prequel is going to be the WandaVision TV show that will be on Disney Plus, coming out around spring, probably March or April of 2021. And before the WandaVision show will be Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. The Ten Rings playing on some previous concepts we saw with the Mandarin in the Iron Man movies now will be fully fleshed out in 2021 as well. And we know that this version of Peter Parker that's in the Marvel Cinematic Universe has a direct link to Tony Stark, who is no longer alive and well in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So where exactly does Spider-Man fit in with the Disney Plus plans for these different shows? I think the overall strategy for making Spider-Man fit is the understanding that you're placing him at a point in time on your schedule that it doesn't conflict with anything else that's previously planned. The next Marvel Cinematic Universe movie comes out May 1st, 2020. That is the Black Widow film that is currently filming and that is going to really flesh out the history and put a nice wrap and bow on Scarlett Johansson's time as the Black Widow in the MCU. Following that movie is going to be November 6, 2020. That'll be The Eternals, which will be a movie that is more cosmic-based than it is earthbound superheroes-based. So neither one of those films would be affected by Spider-Man and don't affect Spider-Man either. Also coming out in 2020 is expected to be the Winter Soldier and Falcon television show on Disney+. We should also know that other shows like Loki's television show, that won't be affected by Spider-Man either. And putting Spider-Man after the Doctor Strange movie allows for Marvel to have their already planned build-up to the Doctor Strange movie with the different television shows. The question is, what is Spider-Man's relation going to be to the rest of the MCU, aside from just capitalizing on the cliffhanger from the second movie, where it was announced to the world Spider-Man's true identity and the return of Jonah Jameson to the Spider-Man universe in full throttle as the head of the Daily Bugle. I think the bigger picture is going to be less about what happens in 2021, outside of what happens with the television shows and the next set of movies when it comes to team-ups. I think that we'll see Spider-Man in his second appearance in probably 2022 or later. And the reason I say that is because you have a situation where you have two film properties that are totally on the outside looking in right now in terms of confirmed dates. We know that there are specific dates that Disney and Marvel have set aside for upcoming movies, that being February 18th and July 29th in 2022. The expectation is that the films Blade and Guardians of the Galaxy 3 would be somewhere in the 2022 timeline. Now, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is a very tenuous situation because James Gunn is currently directing and filming the Suicide Squad movie for DC, a project that he committed himself to before Marvel brought him back for Guardians of the Galaxy 3. So there's a possibility that Guardians of the Galaxy 3 may not actually get done until early 2023 for a release date. I'm not saying that's the truth. I'm just saying there's speculation, and Marvel may need to fill one of those other two 2022 dates, not just with Blade, but with something else. And that's where Spider-Man comes in. You see, there's a method to the madness when it comes to Marvel and Disney releasing these dates. Do not overlook the fact that Kevin Feige specifically said in multiple interviews at the expos, at the D23, that they are saving a lot of the bigger projects, the things that are going to go to the next level for Phase 5. And Phase 5 does not start until 2022. So whatever you see happen in Spider-Man 3, the aftermath of it will not take effect until Phase 5, which is where Spider-Man will come into the picture. And do not be surprised if Spider-Man has a role in an upcoming Fantastic Four film. Marvel is very excited about having the Fantastic Four rights back because of the Fox deal. There's actually speculation over at Disney and Marvel Studios that they're more excited about having the Fantastic Four back in their fold than they are actually the X-Men. And part of that is because the X-Men have a history at Fox of some cinematic success. X1 and X2 in the early to mid 2000s were wildly successful properties, even though they were not true to the comics fully. They were properties that were very successful. The solo movies with Hugh Jackman, such as the Wolverine and Logan, were also financial successes, along with the soft reboot of the X-Men universe with movies like X-Men First Class and X-Men Days of Future Past. While the final two X-Men movies did not do as well at the box office as the other films, there is a 15-year success story of these X-Men movies. And since Marvel has also confirmed that Deadpool will be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe played by Ryan Reynolds, there's no rush for Marvel to try to do too much with the X-Men and with mutants, especially considering that the upcoming Eternals movie is going to give a lot of clarity to some more history and some more big picture understanding of the relation of different entities inside the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Having these open dates will allow, if Marvel wants to have the Fantastic Four involved in the MCU. And since it was already a picture drawn that Peter Parker will fulfill part of the void left by Tony Stark, and Peter Parker is supposed to be this high intellect, it only makes sense for him, not just because of his comic book history, but his place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for him to have something to do with the Fantastic Four, especially since their leader, Reed Richards, is considered one of the smartest men in all Marvel Comics. It's a well-known fact that the people at Marvel looked at a lot of the films that were done by people outside of their control, whether it was the Punisher films, whether it was the Fantastic Four movies, and other properties, and said, we could do that better. And they've proven that they can do their characters better than anyone else can do. And I think that the reality is that bringing in the Fantastic Four is an opportunity for Marvel to really shape the future of their entire universe, not just on Disney Plus and the movies, but also how people view Marvel, because the Fantastic Four are an integral part of Marvel comic book history. In fact, Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four have worked together multiple times over the years in the comics, and it would be a perfect link for Peter Parker and Tom Holland's character to be involved with the Fantastic Four. And so that's what I think they're going to eventually do. I know they're going to come up with either a Young Avengers or a New Avengers property at some point in Phase 5 or potentially beyond that. The only reason I say it might be potentially beyond that is because with the introductions of the TV shows in Phase 5 like She-Hulk, Miss Marvel, as well as Moon Knight, also the knowledge that we know that a second Captain Marvel movie is coming. We don't have a date for it yet. There's a lot to still be fleshed out with the big picture of what Marvel is doing moving forward. But the confirmation that Spider-Man is coming back is going to be part of that story. It's going to be part of that build-up. And I think part of that build-up is going to specifically be about the Fantastic Four. And considering that the Marvel Studios have kind of given an indirect message to audiences of what their source material is for a lot of their different properties, I think it's easy to understand what they're probably going to do moving forward. You may be wondering, what on earth are you talking about, Josh? What is this information that Marvel has secretly given us that we didn't know about? Well, the information that's been secretly given out that we didn't particularly know for sure at first is the fact that when Joe Quesada took over the Marvel properties as the main editor, whether it was a direct title or indirectly in the beginning, the boot up of the alternate Marvel universe, known as the Ultimate Marvel Universe, with different characters and different ways of retelling their stories, a lot of the content that you have seen in the comics from 2000 to now has actually made its way on to the big screen. A lot of those comics and a lot of those stories by writers such as Mark Miller, Brian Michael Bendis, and other writers, as well as Jonathan Hickman, have had a major impact on the characters as you've seen them portrayed in the movies. I mentioned Jonathan Hickman specifically because Jonathan Hickman had an incredible run of Fantastic Four comics about 10 years ago, and Spider-Man was part of that Fantastic Four storyline. While I don't think they're going to go as big and explosive and powerful as they did in that comic, I think the way that those characters were presented in Spider-Man's relationship with the Fantastic Four is something that can be replicated on the big screen very easily. And considering that Jonathan Hickman has now come out with a new comic book series about the X-Men and kind of changing X-Men and mutant history, I think that's going to be a foundation point for what they're going to do in the movies as well. Again, they're not going to do exactly what's going to happen in the comics, because some of the stuff that happens in the comics has to do with the specific stories that are being told during the comics around those events. But as we saw, whether it was Captain America Civil War had some connective tissue to the comic. The first two Avengers movies had connective tissue to the Ultimate Universe comics. We also saw that the portrayal of Iron Man had less to do with the Iron Man comics in the 60s than it did with the portrayal of the character in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So Marvel is constantly giving you information to say, this is kind of what we're going to do with these characters. And we're seeing that as well with Doctor Strange, in relation to his upcoming film, has a lot to do with what we saw in the 1970s with Doctor Strange. So while it's very exciting that Spider-Man is coming back in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Marvel is also utilizing the popularity of Spider-Man to help further other storylines. So do not be surprised if those open dates in 2022 have less to do with Guardians of the Galaxy and Blade as much as they do with potentially the Fantastic Four and Captain Marvel 2 for the Marvel Cinematic Universe in Disney+. Thanks for listening to episode 51 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you have any thoughts on the topics we covered on this edition of the podcast, you can drop it in the comment section below. If you enjoy the content I bring you here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast, hit that like button and subscribe so you can get immediate access to the podcast as I bring you my perspective on the world of sports and comic book movies and television. I'm Josh Hennig, and thanks for listening to this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast.